In the winter of 1315, rain had fallen across Europe for 7 months straight. Harvests rotted in the fields. From England to Poland, peasants were eating things that would make a modern stomach revolt. Number 14 on this list was so foul that monks recorded its stench in their chronicles. Number 3 was a famine food so desperate that a French village banned it by law. And number 1, the meal that kept more medieval families alive than any other, was something we would refuse to feed a dog today. These 20 foods got peasants through winters when one bad harvest meant mass death. Hit subscribe. Let us count down the 20 brutal foods medieval peasants choked down to survive winter. Number 20. Boiled nettles. By late March, the grain bin was empty and the new crops were months away. This was the hungry gap, the killing season when more medieval peasants died than at any other time of year. The first green things to push through the cold soil were stinging nettles. A starving family wrapped their hands in rags, tore the plants from the ditch banks behind the cottage, and dropped them into a pot of boiling water. The boiling broke the sting. What remained was a bitter, slimy, dark green mass that tasted of iron and wet stone. They ate it with a wooden spoon straight from the pot, sometimes thickened with a handful of oats if any were left. A monk at the Abbey of St. Albans wrote in 1316 that village women were stripping the nettles bare for half a mile around the manor. Nothing else was growing. Nothing else would be for weeks. Number 19. Stewed old cabbage. The cabbages came in during October and were eaten head by head through November. What was left in the garden by January was the outer leaves nobody wanted and the woody stalks frozen into the ground. A peasant wife chopped at the frozen earth with a hand axe to free what she could, then carried the slimy yellow leaves back to the cottage and boiled them for 2 hours with a piece of pork rind from the smokehouse. The kitchen filled with a sulphurous, sour smell that hung in the wool of every garment in the cottage. The broth was thin and gray, the cabbage strings caught between teeth. But the pork rind gave it just enough fat to keep a body warm through a January night. This was Tuesday supper. This was Wednesday supper. The pot stayed on the fire, and the family ate from it until it was gone. Number 18. Pickled turnips. The turnip crop came up in autumn and was buried in straw in the root cellar to keep through winter. But by February, half of them had gone soft. The wife sliced what was salvageable into thick rounds, packed them into a wooden crock with salt and a splash of last year's vinegar, weighted them down with a flat stone, and let them sour for a month in the cold dark. By March, the turnips were limp, sharp, and the color of pale ivory. They came out of the brine tasting of salt and rot in equal measure. Eaten cold with a piece of black bread, they delivered just enough vitamin C to keep teeth in the mouth and gums from bleeding. Sailors centuries later would learn the same trick with cabbage and call it a discovery. Medieval peasants had been doing it for 400 years. Number 17. Sauerkraut. Across the Germanic kingdoms and the Slavic East, every cottage had a sauerkraut crock buried in the corner of the larder. Shredded cabbage layered with salt, weighted with a stone, left to ferment for 6 weeks until it turned pale, sour, and stinging in the nose. By February, the entire household smelled of it. The crock was opened once a day, a handful pulled out with bare fingers, and eaten with whatever scrap of meat or grease was available. The acid bite of fermented cabbage was a shock to a tired tongue. It woke a person up. It also kept them alive, because something in those fermented leaves prevented the gum-rotting sickness that killed sailors and soldiers through winter. A Bohemian peasant family in 1380 might keep 3 crocks at once, staggering them by month, so the supply never ran out. The smell never ran out either. Number 16. Peas pottage. Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. The children's rhyme was not poetry. It was an accurate description of how a medieval peasant family ate dried peas. A pot of yellow or gray peas was set to boil before dawn with water, salt, and a chunk of bacon rind. By noon, the peas had broken down into a thick, mealy, beige sludge. The family ate from it that night. They reheated it the next morning. They reheated it again that night. They added water as it thickened. By day 5, the bottom layer had turned bitter and slightly fermented. By day 9, the whole thing tasted faintly of yeast and decay. They ate it anyway. A pound of dried peas cost less than a penny in 1340. It fed a family for a week. The flavor was beyond questioning. Number 15, frumenti. This was Christmas food in England, and it was supposed to be a luxury. Cracked wheat boiled slowly in milk for 3 hours until it broke down into a thick, pale, lumpy porridge, then flavored with whatever the household had managed to save. A scrape of honey, a pinch of saffron if the Lord's kitchen had let some go, a few raisins set aside since autumn. Served warm in wooden bowls on the morning of December the 25th, it was the closest thing to celebration most peasants saw all year. But by 12th night, the leftover frumenti sat in a cold crock by the door, hardening into a gray jelly that smelled faintly of soured milk. It was eaten cold with a horn spoon. It tasted of nothing in particular except the memory of Christmas, which was already fading. Number 14, salted herring. First pattern break. Here is where the smell of the medieval winter gets serious. A peasant household on the North Sea coast might own 2 barrels of salted herring, packed in late autumn when the great fishing fleets came in from Yarmouth and the Baltic. Each barrel held 1,000 fish, layered head to tail in coarse salt. The fish were rust orange, leathery, and stiff with brine. To prepare one, the wife pulled it from the barrel, soaked it for a full day in cold water to draw out the worst of the salt, then fried it in lard. By February, the surface fish had begun to turn. By April, what remained at the bottom of the barrel was rancid, fly-blown, and smelled like a battlefield. Here is the part that breaks your stomach. A monk named Walter of Norwich wrote in 1342 that during a poor herring year, the stench from peasant cottages was so strong he covered his face when riding through the village. He called it the smell of survival. The peasants did not notice it. A single barrel of herring at the start of winter cost 3 shillings, more than a week's wages for a field hand. The smell came free. Number 13, stockfish. If salted herring was the smell of survival, stockfish was the sound of it. Dried cod from the Norwegian coast was traded across Europe in bundles so hard they could be used as planks. A peasant could not cut stockfish with a knife. He laid it on a wooden block and beat it with a wooden hammer until the fibers softened enough to soak. Even after a full day in cold water, the flesh remained tough, stringy, and tasted faintly of old leather. Cooks boiled it in milk if they had any, in water if they did not, and served it with mustard or vinegar to mask what could not be masked. A 2-pound piece of stockfish cost about 4 pence at a London market in 1370 and lasted a family 3 meals. It was the standard food of Lent. 40 days every year, half of Europe ate fish that had to be beaten with a hammer before it could be cooked. Number 12, smoked eels. The fenlands of eastern England produced eels in such enormous quantities that monastic rents were often paid in them. A peasant family living near a river smoked their autumn catch over slow alder wood for 3 days, hanging the long black bodies from the cottage rafters. By December, the kitchen ceiling was lined with smoked eels like leather straps. They tasted of fat, smoke, and river silt in equal parts. The flesh was oily, soft, and stained the fingers brown. Children ate them split open on dark bread. Men ate them with raw onion. The skin was tough and chewy and was never removed. By the end of winter, the last eels hanging in the rafters had developed a fine gray mold along their backs. The mold was scraped off with a knife. The eel was eaten anyway. Nothing was wasted. Number 11. Verjuice. Wine was for lords. Vinegar was expensive. So peasants in southern France, Italy, and the wine-growing regions made verjuice from unripe grapes pressed in late summer and stored in stoneware jugs. The juice was sharp, sour, and slightly metallic, somewhere between lemon and vinegar. It was poured over boiled vegetables to give them flavor. It was mixed into stews to cut the greasiness of pork. It was drunk by the spoonful when the throat felt sore. Nobody enjoyed it. It was tolerated because it brightened food that desperately needed brightening. A peasant family in Burgundy in 1380 might use verjuice in nearly every cooked meal through the long winter months. The bottle sat on the table next to the salt. It was the only acid most peasants tasted from October until the first fresh fruit of June. Number 10. Brawn. The November pig slaughter was the event of the year in every English village. The animal was killed, bled, and butchered in a single day, and nothing was wasted. The head was reserved for brawn. The skull was split, cleaned, and simmered for 6 hours with cloves and salt until every scrap of meat fell from the bone. The cooked meat was picked apart, packed tightly into a cloth-lined mold with some of the rich, gelatinous cooking liquid, and pressed under a heavy stone overnight. By morning, it had set into a solid, pale block veined with pieces of cheek, tongue, and ear, suspended in a translucent jelly that wobbled when sliced. Brawn fed a family for 2 weeks. It was eaten cold with mustard. The texture was unsettling to anyone not raised on it. A child knew exactly which slice held the ear cartilage and which held the soft, dark meat from the eye socket. Nobody complained. Number 9. Mortrews. Second pattern break. By midwinter, the peasant teeth that had not already been lost to abscess or accident were too worn to chew tough meat. Mortrews was the solution. Whatever cured pork or salted poultry the family had was simmered until soft, pounded in a wooden mortar with breadcrumbs and broth until it became a thick beige paste, then seasoned with whatever the household could spare. A pinch of sage, a scrape of dried pepper. Served warm in a wooden bowl, mortrews looked like wet sawdust and tasted of compressed meat fibers. Here is what nobody talks about anymore. Medieval peasants in their late 20s often had the dental health of modern 80-year-olds. By 35, many were toothless. Mortrews was not a delicacy. It was an accommodation, a way for a family to share a single pot of meat across 3 generations when the oldest could no longer chew and the youngest had not yet grown the teeth to try. Modern food culture has spent the last decade rediscovering pates and rillettes and selling them at $12 a jar. Medieval peasants invented them out of necessity, ate them out of need, and never called them gourmet. Number 8. Blood pudding. On slaughter day, the pig was hung by its hind legs and bled into a wooden bucket. Every drop was caught. The blood was stirred constantly to prevent clotting, then mixed warm with oats, suet, onions, salt, and whatever herbs the cottage garden had dried. The mixture was forced into the cleaned intestine of the pig, tied at the ends, and boiled for 2 hours until it set into a black, dense sausage with a faint sheen of fat. Sliced thick and fried in lard, blood pudding was Sunday breakfast through the long, cold months. The flavor was iron, mineral, and earthy, with a slight metallic edge that lingered at the back of the tongue. A 4-foot length of blood pudding fed a family for a week. It was the most efficient use of an animal that medieval cooking ever devised. Number 7. Salt pork. The pork barrel sat in the corner of every peasant larder, packed in coarse salt and dry cured for months. By February, the meat had become so thoroughly preserved that it was the texture of soft wood. To cook it, the wife sawed off a chunk with a serrated blade, soaked it overnight in 3 changes of cold water to draw out the worst of the salt, then dropped it into a pot of beans, peas, or cabbage. It released its flavor slowly, perfuming the entire pot with smoke and brine. The meat itself, when picked apart, was salty, stringy, and faintly gray. It was the only animal protein most peasants tasted between Christmas and Easter. a medieval pig dressed out at about 120 pounds. After salting, it produced enough preserved pork to feed a family of 6 through 5 months of winter. Number 6. Bone marrow broth. When the salt pork ran low and the salted beef ran lower, the peasant wife reached for the bones. Every bone from every slaughtered animal had been saved through the year, hung in the rafters or buried in cold storage, waiting for the lean months. She cracked them open with the back of an axe, exposed the soft yellow marrow, and dropped the lot into a pot of water with onions and salt. Simmered for the entire day, the bones released their fat, their collagen, and their minerals into a thick golden broth that coated the spoon and clung to the lips. It was drunk in wooden cups, ladled over stale bread, and given to the sick and the very old. Modern restaurants now sell bone broth in 12-ounce cartons for $9. Medieval peasants made it from the bones of animals they had named. Number 5. Acorn bread. When the rye and the wheat ran out, the family turned to the forest. Acorns gathered. The previous autumn from the oak woods were soaked in running water for a full week to leach out the tannins, then dried, ground in a hand mill, and mixed with whatever grain was left to make a coarse, dark, gritty bread. The leaching never quite worked. The bread came out of the oven with a bitter, astringent edge that dried the mouth and made the throat constrict. It was the bread of last resort, eaten in the worst weeks of February and March when the granary held only mice. A French chronicle from the famine of 1316 records peasants in Picardy eating acorn bread for 6 weeks straight. By the end of those 6 weeks, half the village was dead. The acorn bread had kept the other half alive. Barely. Number 4. Maslin bread. Third pattern break. This is the bread that fed medieval Europe, and modern Americans would not recognize it as food. Maslin was a mixed grain, usually rye and barley, sometimes with oats or beans ground in, milled coarsely at the village mill, baked weekly in heavy round loaves in the communal oven. Here is what nobody mentions in food history shows. The flour was not sifted. The bread contained chaff, husk, small stones from the mill, and sometimes ergot, the fungus that grew on damp rye and caused hallucinations, gangrene, and death by the thousands. A peasant family ate maslin bread 3 times a day, every day, for a lifetime. By 30, most peasants had ground their molars down to flat stubs from chewing it. The teeth were worn smooth, like river pebbles. Archaeologists studying medieval peasant skeletons can identify the diet by the dental wear alone. We have forgotten this completely. We sell artisanal whole grain bread at $6 a loaf and call it heritage. The peasants who actually ate it lost their teeth before they lost their hair. Number 3. Tree bark bread. This is the entry that should make a modern stomach turn. During the worst famine years, particularly the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, peasants across northern Europe stripped the inner bark from elm, birch, and pine trees, dried it, ground it to a coarse powder, and mixed it with whatever grain dust remained in the bottom of the granary to make bread. The bread was gritty, fibrous, and tasted of resin and dirt. It caused severe constipation in some, violent diarrhea in others. It tore the lining of the throat going down. But it contained just enough carbohydrate to keep a body breathing for one more day. In Norway and Sweden, the practice continued into the 18th century during bad harvest years. In France, the village of Charny formally banned tree bark bread by ordinance in 1342, declaring it unfit for human consumption and a sign of municipal shame. The people of Charny ate it anyway when the alternative was death. They lit fires in the hearth, baked the bark into loaves, and fed it to their children with whatever cold water they could draw from the well. Number 2. Lard on rye bread. In the long months between Christmas and Easter, this was breakfast, lunch, and supper for half of medieval Europe. A slice of dense, dark rye bread, spread thick with rendered pork lard from the autumn slaughter, eaten cold standing by the door before the day's work began. The lard was kept in a stoneware crock in the larder, white and dense at first, turning yellow and then faintly rancid by March. The bread was hard. The lard was greasy. Together, they delivered enough calories to keep a peasant working in the cold fields for 10 hours. There was no butter for most families. There was no jam, no honey, no preserves. There was only bread and fat and the salt to make it taste like food. A peasant household consumed roughly 2 pounds of lard per person per month through winter. Modern nutritionists would call this diet a heart attack waiting to happen. The peasants who ate it lived to 40, died of plague or childbirth, and never had clogged arteries. Number 1. Pottage. At the top of this list is the meal that defined medieval peasant life more completely than any other. Pottage was the eternal pot. A large iron cauldron hung over the fire from October to April, never washed, never emptied. Into it went whatever the household had. Yesterday's leftover beans, a handful of barley, a withered carrot from the cellar, a piece of salt pork, a bunch of nettles in spring, a chunk of cabbage in autumn. The pot simmered constantly. Water was added when it grew thick. Vegetables were added when it ran low. The bottom layer was scorched, crusted, and almost burnt by the end of each week. The top layer was a thin gray-green broth flecked with whatever had been thrown in that morning. Pottage was breakfast. It was supper. It was the food of the sick and the food of the well. It was eaten with a wooden spoon out of a shared wooden bowl by every member of the family. The flavor changed every day and never improved. The texture was uneven. The temperature was barely warm. We would refuse to feed it to a dog today. But pottage kept medieval Europe alive for 1,000 years. There is no exaggeration in that sentence. The single greatest invention of medieval peasant food was the refusal to ever stop cooking. The pot never went cold. The pot never went empty. As long as the pot was on the fire, the family was still alive. Here is the challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. Boil a bowl of nettles. Cook a pot of peas pottage and eat it for 3 days. Spread cold lard on dark bread for breakfast. Then sit at the table and eat it slowly. Because these foods were not punishment. They were what stood between a peasant family and the grave. Share which one you would actually try in the comments. I want to know if anyone is brave enough to attempt the tree bark bread, or whether the salt pork sounds more reasonable. Because these were not just brutal meals. They were the difference between waking up in March and not waking up at all.